But let me just introduce Peter Harrison a little bit. He's the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. He's been there since 2007. Before that, he studied Science and Arts at Queensland University, then he was at Yale, and he was a founder of Bond University in its foundation year, I should say, before he went to Oxford. He's written several books on religion in the English Enlightenment and the Bible, Protestantism and the Rise of Natural Sciences. And his research is really on early modern thought from the 16th to the 19th century, so he's really well placed to talk about the foundation of the Royal Society. You might know, if you read the Times Higher Education supplement, that there's an article about this lecture and what he's going to be saying partly in today's issue, so you might want to look that up. The foundation of the Royal Society was interesting because in its foundation documents, in its charter, it said that its activities will be devoted to the glory of God, the Creator, and the advantage of the human race. And yet we know that almost as soon as they got going, the fellows scrupulously avoided meddling with divinity, metaphysics, or morals, they said. So I think Peter's going to tell us how these 2 points in tension played out in the early days of the Royal Society. So thank you, Peter.
Well, thanks, Bob. As always, it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about this, well, to me at least, interesting topic in this, the 350th anniversary year of the founding of the Royal Society. It's often assumed, I think, certainly by the public and in the media, that modern science was accompanied by an increasing separation between science and religion, and that this made possible for science the liberation from the stifling influence of religion. Now, viewed in this light, through this particular prism, the achievements of the early Royal Society, founded in the 1660s, were premised on a sharp differentiation between science and religion, and by the refusal of the fellows, as we've just heard, to meddle with divinity. Now, in keeping with this view of history, we find in this recent and popular history of the Royal Society this statement, that while the dead hand of the Catholic Church stopped the scientific revolution in Italy, Britain, some intervening prose, Britain had a conflict of a different kind and produced a group of people determined, as we shall see, to keep religion out of science and to publish their discoveries for all to see. Now, historians can pick faults with virtually every phrase in this statement, but that said, I think there's some justification for the claim at the end that these people seem to want to keep religion out of science. And this group obviously was the Royal Society, I should say in passing. I like the jacket of this book. It shows the university that made the greatest contribution to the early foundation of the Royal Society. And I'm sure you'll recognise its famous silhouette. At any rate, in terms of evidence for this claim, we find in a famous memorandum, usually attributed to Robert Hooke, but in fact the work of Robert Moray, and that goes to say, it gives the remarks that Bob mentioned, that the fellows of the society scrupulously avoided meddling with divinity, metaphysics and morals. Bishop Thomas Spratt, who wrote the first history of the Royal Society, somewhat prematurely we might think in 1667 or across the course of the 1660s, agreed that the Royal Society is abundantly cautious not to meddle in spiritual things, and goes on to say its members meddle no otherwise in divine things. So we're getting this familiar theme. So Robert Moray, when he's writing about the philosophical transactions and what their content would be, again says the philosophical transactions being the official journal of the Royal Society and the oldest continuously published scientific journal. He said that the journal would not be concerned with legal or theological matters. Right? All of this then seems to endorse this last claim that what's going on in the early Royal Society is a separation of these two things, science and religion. Now, in spite of this apparently unambiguous endorsement of this separation of science and religion in the 17th century, and this separation in terms of what's going on in the Royal Society, historians have taken a somewhat different view about the relations of science and religion. In the 1930s, the sociologist Robert K. Merton analysed the religious affiliations of the early members of the Royal Royal Society and developed a very influential thesis according to which elements of the Puritan ethos promoted the development of modern science. Subsequently, the Oxford historian Charles Webster claimed that the great flourishing of scientific activity in the decades immediately preceding the foundation of the Royal Society was motivated by Puritan millenarianism. And most recently, Stephen Gaukroger has argued against a general picture of a separation of science and religion during this period, and he contends that actually the enterprises of science and religion enjoyed a more intimate relation, and that it was the capacity of science to harness the legitimising powers of religion that made possible its success. And I've mounted similar arguments in my own work. So there's the Burton book. There's the recent Stephen Gaukroger book, 2005. Let me modestly put my own book up there, which is 2007. Now, the idea that religion played some role in the Royal Society's understanding of its activities also draws support from the contemporary witnesses. The 1662 Charter declares that the activities of the Society, again as Bob mentioned at the outset, shall be devoted to the glory of God and the advantage of the human race, and its officers were required to swear an oath upon the holy Gospels of God. And while Thomas Spratt, who wrote that very first history of the Society, observed that the fellows do not meddle with spiritual things, he noted at the same time that the new philosophy, that is to say the new science, would be advantageous to the Christian religion, and that experimental study of nature was really a form of religious worship. Finally, we can say that a number of key figures in the early Royal Society made explicit connections between their scientific activities and their religious convictions. Now, what all of this suggests is that the question about the relations between science and religion during this period, and the question of the separation of science and religion, is a somewhat complicated one. And what I want to do for the rest of this lecture is to shed some light on how we can make sense of those apparently contradictory tendencies there, the notion of separation, the notion that somehow religion is intimately involved. So we're going to look, first of all, I'm going to talk about meddling with divinity and just make a few terminological distinctions. Then I'm going to talk about some general ways in which we can understand how religion influences science. I'm going then to address the specific thesis of a Puritan influence on the ideology of the Royal Society, and then I'm going to look very quickly at two case studies. So we'll look at two key figures in the early Royal Society and see what their views were on this particular question. So I think the first thing we can say about meddling with divinity is we can make a distinction between divinity and theology, or divinity and religion. And for the most part, what divinity means in the context of these discussions is specific doctrines of theology that are likely to be controversial. That's the context in which we find these expressions appearing. So it's a mistake to think that divinity is directly to be equated with theology or directly to be equated with religion. And when we combine it with this issue of meddling, the meaning of meddling at this particular time relates precisely to this question of controversy. So the way we translate these statements about meddling with divinity is that the fellows of the Royal Society will avoid religious controversy, that they will avoid talking about those specific elements of theology that are likely to be disputed in general. And there were plenty of them around at the time, but they didn't really go to what we might call the core of Christian teaching, which is to do with God as a creator. Now, we'll see exactly how this is the case when we start to look at our specific examples. So I really just want to say, in terms of these notions about meddling with divinity, that once we understand a little bit about the context of meddling with divinity, we understand that it doesn't necessarily mean what we've always assumed it means. Indeed, even in the context of theological works, we find authors saying, in this theological work, I will not be meddling with divinity. Okay? Which is to say, I'm not going to be engaged in the business of religious controversy. And one other terminological issue, I think, before I go on, the subject matter of what the Royal Society was actually doing, if we look at the initial group, they were concerned to found a college that dealt with physico-mathematical experimental learning. They don't talk about science. The Charter talks about, I think, improving natural knowledge. But the specific disciplinary categories that they're involved in are natural philosophy and natural history. And I don't want to give you a long diatribe about what historians have said about the identities of these specific categories, and to some extent these categories were shifting. But if we take natural philosophy to be what the Royal Society are about, and natural philosophy of course figures in the title of Newton's famous Principia, Newton has this definition of natural philosophy. He talks about the most beautiful system of the sun, the planets, the comets, and says they could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent, powerful being. And he goes on to conclude that discourse of God from the appearances of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy. So what you might say is if you take Newton's conception of natural philosophy and you have a group of individuals who are engaged in this activity of natural philosophy, inevitably there will be some reference to God. Okay? Now I say that's on Newton's account. There are competing conceptions of natural philosophy. Some historians have made the claim, a historian based here actually, that natural philosophy is essentially about God during this period. Right? I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but certainly Newton has this notion that natural philosophy includes in its content some reference to God. Okay, so that I think helps us deal with the terminological issues. I want again to stick with some generic questions about ways in which religion might influence science. And again, I think once we get an understanding of these general ways in which religion might influence science, we can start to unpack this apparently complicated set of relations between science and religion at this time. And I must confess that these ways that I'm about to put up, I have directly lifted from John Brooks' book, Science and Religions, Some Historical Considerations. The first way in which we can talk about religion and science relations is that religion might provide presuppositions for scientific activity. And one example here, I'm not going to give large examples except for two in a moment, but one example here is the new conception that there are laws of nature, there are mathematical laws of nature. This is a new conception that comes into existence in the 17th century. It's explicitly premised on a notion that God instantiates laws, mathematical laws in the natural order, and Descartes explicitly says this, as we will see in a moment. René Descartes is a key figure in this conception. Insofar as science rests on the conception of natural laws then, there is an underlying theological assumption, at least there was in the 17th century. Of course, those theological presuppositions were subsequently lost, but nonetheless the origin of our conception of laws of nature was a theological one, and this was explicitly stated by people like René Descartes and Isaac Newton. A second way I think we can talk about the influence of science and religion is to say that religious conceptions inform choices between competing scientific theories or models. It's very common to find people in the 17th century making the claim that the reason they're wedded to this particular scientific conception is that they believe it to be more consistent with Christian orthodoxy. So Newton argues that his system is more consistent with Christianity than the Cartesian system with which it was competing. Leibniz famously criticised the Newtonian system because he thought it was insulting to have a God who had to keep tweaking the solar system to keep everything running. So these theological considerations play a role in these sorts of discussions about whether we should prefer model A or model B. Scientific religious conceptions can underpin specific modes of investigation, and historians have argued, and I include myself among them, that theological, particularly religious or theological ideas such as theological voluntarism or the idea of the fall informed the experimental and empirical approach adopted by 17th century natural philosophers. I won't say much more than that. Now, a fourth way in which religion might influence science is that it might motivate particular individual investigators. And we can say here, I think, that almost without exception, early modern natural philosophers cherished religious convictions. They may not necessarily have all been orthodox, but they were nonetheless, for the most part, had religious convictions. And some made the explicit point that they were motivated to natural philosophical activity because of their religious convictions. That's what they say. They don't all say that, but some of them do. And the fifth way I think that we can talk about religion influencing science is that it might make up the constitutive content of some scientific positions. Thus, for much of the 18th century, the pursuit of natural history was understood to some extent as a quest for divine design and the natural order. So there's the content of the science is itself kind of theological. And insofar as Newton makes the claim that the ultimate aim of natural philosophy is to reach to the first cause God, we can see that theological conceptions do seem to be playing a substantive role in his natural philosophy. Now, as I've said, this is not the place for... I'll give you one more. This is the important one, actually. That religion can offer social sanctions for scientific endeavours. And I think that this is a key element of what Robert Merton wanted to argue in the 30s, what Stephen Gorkroj has argued most recently, and indeed what I would like to argue, and that is that science during the 17th century needed to be underpinned by a set of values, and the values that people in the Royal Society typically lighted upon were religious ones. Okay, and we're going to see how this is the case. Now, as I said, this is not the occasion for a detailed discussion of these modes, but just to give you some idea of how these might give rise to paradoxical outcomes that we might not expect, I want to take the case of Descartes and the case of laws of nature. These laws of nature, as I said, they act as presuppositions for 17th century science, and there's little doubt that these laws were then understood as having been instantiated by God. When Descartes sets out his 3 laws of motion, he says this: God imparts various motions to the parts of matter when he first created them, and he now preserves all this matter in the same way and by the same process by which he originally created it. And Descartes goes on to say the laws of nature are immutable. They are immutable because the divine lawgiver is himself by his nature immutable. So the immutability of the laws of nature is guaranteed by this particular theological understanding of God. But note what happens as a consequence of this is that the world actually becomes an insulated realm where these laws are immutable, and in a sense this guarantees the independence of science, because in the Cartesian worldview, God is not constantly intervening. So although there's a theological premise, the consequence of the premise is in a sense to keep an intervening deity out of the picture. Now, this is not the universal view of how it's done, and indeed Pascal famously criticised Descartes for having this God who set the whole thing up and running and then left it. But you can see how the invocation of this theological notion might give rise to a kind of scientific enterprise for which, although God, in a sense for Descartes, intimately involved in every step, because God's activities are immutable on the Cartesian picture, in a sense this guarantees the independence of this realm for what we would call scientific investigation. So there's a little paradox there, I think. And another way, just to make this point about how this the interactions of science and religion might have quite paradoxical results, is to think about this general point. And Stephen Shapin, for example, tells us is that the more a body of knowledge is understood to be objective and disinterested, the more valuable it is as a tool in moral and political action. Now, if we apply this principle to what's going on in the 17th century, many 17th century natural historians believe that the disinterested study of the structures of living things could provide independent support of the truth of the Christian religion and refute atheism. But the study of nature could only offer such support if it was the kind of activity that was based on premises that the atheist could accept. So you're not going to get an apologetic argument if you've got religious premises smuggled into the argument already. So again, we have a case where paradoxically individuals might be motivated by religious considerations to ensure the religious neutrality of their scientific endeavours. Now, perhaps the single most important mode of science-religion reactions, and the one that I'm going to dwell on most here, is the way in which religion can provide social sanctions for scientific activity. We've become accustomed to thinking of science as intrinsically worth pursuing, or as justified by its practical outcomes in the sphere of technology and medicine, for example. But while we think that one of the chief complaints against the activities of the early Royal Society was that the knowledge it generated was useless, that its scientific program was inconsistent with widely held values about the purposes of learning, and that its general philosophy was conducive to impiety. And I can give you a long list of examples about how the activities of the Royal Society were lampooned and ridiculed, but you're probably most familiar with the presentation of the Royal Society in Jonathan Swift's Academy. And all of these sorts of activities can be directly mapped onto some of the things that the Royal Society was up to. So one thing we have to bear in mind is that in the 17th century, science did not occupy the prestigious place that it does currently, and it required justification. People had to appeal to other external things to provide the sanctions that were going to get this operation up and running. And as we'll see in their apologetic defences of Royal Society activities, very often appeal was made to religion. And again, we'll see this when we look at our case examples. All right, so what I've done here, I've tried to clarify a few of the terms: divinity, meddling, theology, natural philosophy. I've tried to look then at some of the ways in which, very quickly, some of the ways in which we might think about science and religion interactions, and the ways in which it's not as simple just to say we've got a separation of science and religion, that religious considerations are intimately involved in every step of the way, but it doesn't mean that religion is somehow tainting the scientific enterprise. I think that's the point that we need to bear in mind. Now, having done that, what I want to do now is to talk about this question of social sanctions, that is to say, ways in which, specifically, religion might give the scientific enterprise some social credibility and values. And the specific case I want to take is the one that's interested historians for most of the last 100 years, not all historians, mind you, but some. And that's the Puritanism and science thesis that was first mounted by a group of thinkers in the 1930s, the last century. Now, if we think about the history of science during the first decades of the 20th century, I think it's fair to say that historical understandings of the relation between science and religion tended to follow the general lines of the conflict thesis that's famously associated with the figures of John Draper and Andrew Dixon White. In the 1930s, however, a group of writers, a number of writers, perhaps it's better to say, Dorothy Stimson, R.F. Jones, R.K. Merton and S.F. Mason, began to explore possible positive connections between Puritanism and the remarkable flourishing of science that took place in 17th century England. A major focus of attention in these explorations was the membership of the early Royal Society. So there was sociological number crunching work going on. In 1935, Dorothy Stimson analysed the religious and political affiliations of the 10 members of this early group that met in London and Oxford, and who later became the nucleus of the early Royal Society. And what she argued was that one of the group was definitely Anglican. 2 of their religious commitments she could not determine, but the remaining seven, she says, were Puritan in training and parliamentary in affiliation. And this was a remarkably disproportionate number given what was going on in the population. Extending her analysis to the 1662 membership of the Society, which at that time numbered 119, she determined that of the 87 whose religious allegiances could be established, about half had Puritan experience in greater or lesser degree. On this basis, she argued, along with R.F. Jones, Puritanism provided a particularly fertile soil for the utilitarian approach espoused by Francis Bacon, and hence from there to scientific activity of the kind that we see in England. Now, Robert Merton, the sociologist, followed in 1938 with his celebrated essay that provides the classic account of the link between Puritanism, the Puritan ethic, and the growth and institutionalisation of science. The Merton thesis is typically stated by Robert Merton in a very modest fashion, and I think his critics often forget this. And he says this, quote, "The Puritan ethic, as an ideal typical expression of the value attitudes basic to ascetic Protestantism generally, so canalised the interests of 17th century Englishmen as to constitute one important element in the enhanced cultivation of science." And Merton identified specific elements of the Puritan ethic that he believed led to this special relationship. And he said, here they are. Oh, there's the original statement. Okay. Notice it's a very qualified statement that Merton makes. He didn't say Puritanism is responsible for the rise of modern science. He says Puritanism is responsible for underpinning certain things that were going on in England in the 17th century. And what specifically then does Merton want to argue? We've got Stephen Gilbert there. He wants to argue that, as he says, the Puritan complex of a scarcely distinguished utilitarianism of intramundane interests, methodical unremitting action, thoroughgoing empiricism of the right and even the duty of a free examination, of anti-traditionalism, all of this was congenial to the same values in science. So we map these religious values into the scientific enterprise, and that's what gives the motivations for scientific activity in the 17th century England. Now, it's important to understand that Merton was chiefly seeking an explanation not so much for the emergence of particular methods or scientific doctrines, but rather for the enhanced social standing of science. Okay. For increasing interest in science and technology, for the growth in its prestige, and for the beginnings of its institutionalisation. He also astutely observed that frequent appeals of early modern natural philosophers to religion suggest that, quote, religion was a sufficiently powerful social force to be invoked in support of an activity which was intrinsically less acceptable at the time. End of quote. Now, the membership of the early Royal Society was a test case for the hypothesis, and following Dorothy Stimson, Merton amassed an impressive body of statistical data about the early Royal Society that, for him, confirmed that, quote, the originative spirits of the society were markedly influenced by Puritan conceptions. Merton also drew upon statistical studies from continental Europe that demonstrated a disproportionately large involvement of Protestants in scientific activity. And again, this confirmed his general thesis about the importance of a Protestant ethos in promoting science. Okay. Now, since its first appearance, the Merton thesis has been subjected to considerable discussion, and much of it has been critical. However, it must be said, and I've already alluded to this, that often critics fail to understand the relatively modest scope of the thesis, the qualifications that Merton attached to it, and what it was that he was actually trying to explain. Merton did not contend that Puritanism was somehow a sufficient or even necessary condition for the growth of science. Neither does his thesis entail a denial of Catholic contributions, and particularly the contributions of scientists such as Copernicus, Galileo and Descartes. What Merton sought to account for was the spectacular and unprecedented growth of science in 17th century England. His goal was not an explanation of the emergence of particular scientific ideas, but rather of the increasing cultural prestige of science in England, as embodied in part by the Royal Society. Of lasting importance, in my view, was his realisation that the scientific values that we now tend to take for granted, at that time, required justification and support, and that a particular kind of religious impulse was capable of providing it. That said, one area where criticism is justifiable, I think, lies in difficulties with the idea of a specifically Puritan ethos, and in determining who was or was not a Puritan. The claim that the membership of the Royal Society was disproportionately Puritan is difficult to sustain, I think, and subsequent analyses of the data, as you say here, have suggested otherwise, I think. Part of the problem here is that following the Restoration in 1660, many Puritans conformed, which is to say returned to the Church of England, and these shifting religious allegiances complicate any statistical analysis. The extent of a lingering influence of the Puritan ethos, I think, then becomes a matter of speculation, because one's overt religious allegiance may or may not reflect one's fundamental religious values. Some have argued that the dominant ideology of the Royal Society, insofar as it had one at all, was not Puritan but latitudinarian, and I don't want to go into a long, involved explanation of what latitudinarianism was, but in essence they believed in a compromise in relation to religious dogma, and they were undogmatic in their doctrinal claims and inclined to defer to whatever civil authority determined in matters of religion. They emphasised the importance of piety and morality rather than orthodoxy in belief. And I think the key figure, John Wilkins, does seem to embody this approach. So a latitudinarian ethos would explain the apparent ease with which a number of individuals in the Royal Society could, in good conscience, I think, thrive in both Puritan and Anglican contexts. Now, others have said that actually it's not latitudinarianism, but Anglicanism that's dominant. I don't think these discussions are necessarily overly helpful. Certainly, I think much of the scholarship that addresses the Merton thesis problematises the claim that a specifically Puritan ethic dominated the group. I think that's fair to say. It doesn't necessarily follow from this, however, that some elements of Puritan thought, or elements of Protestantism more generally, might have promoted scientific inquiry. And I think for this reason, the Merton thesis continues to be discussed by historians. One important modification of the thesis was offered by Charles Webster in the 70s in his classic work, The Great Instauration. Webster deals with the group, the period immediately before the Royal Society, and argues that we have then a Puritan millenarianism that is a key feature in the efflorescence of scientific activity in the decades, the 30s and 40s in England. But I won't discuss that thesis in great detail. I do want to turn to this thesis of Stephen Gorkridge, advanced in 2006, and it will give you some sense of how the Merton thesis lives on in the claims that are made in this rather large book, but very interesting book, I think. At least the first chapter is interesting if you're inclined to have a look at it. What Gorkridge points out here is that a number of cultures witness intermittent scientific growth at various times, and he refers to the classical world, China, medieval Islam, medieval Oxford and Paris. But he argues that these scientific movements never consolidated, and science never came to occupy a central place that it does in the contemporary West. In some respects, then, Gorkridge also asks a similar question to the question that Merton asks, I think. He's less interested in why scientific ideas arise in a culture than in the factors that lead to the consolidation and institutionalisation of science once these ideas poke their heads up. And in essence, what Gorkridge argues is that science became successful in the West because over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was able to harness the legitimating power of religion and thus establish itself as a religiously useful enterprise. And I'll give you the quote from the book. A good part of the distinctive success at the level of legitimation and consolidation of the scientific enterprise in the early modern West, and it derives not from any separation of religion and natural philosophy, but rather from the fact that natural philosophy could be accommodated to projects within natural theology. What made natural philosophy attractive to so many in the 17th and 18th centuries were the prospects it offered for the renewal of natural theology, and then the key statement, far from science breaking free from religion in the early modern era, its consolidation depended on religion being in the driving seat. End of quote. So I think Gorkridge's question is similar to Merton's, and to some extent I think his answer is also consonant with that of Merton's. It was the capacity of this new science as embodied in the activities of the Royal Society to be adapted to the purposes and defence of Christianity that led to its incorporation into the natural theological projects of the following centuries. This incorporation was crucial to the consolidation of science in the West. Gorkridge again makes this large claim, quote, Christianity took over natural philosophy in the 17th century, setting its agenda and projecting it forward in a way quite different to any other scientific culture. And this then is the distinctive feature of what's going on in the West. Now, my own work has developed similar themes, and just to quickly skate over these, in this book, The Bible, Protestantism and the Rise of Natural Science, I suggested that the Protestant Reformation effected a dramatic contraction of the realm of the sacred through its constriction of sacramental practices, its incipient iconoclasm, and crucially its emphasis on the word and the literal sense of Scripture. And again, cutting a very long story short, the move away from allegorical readings of Scripture and nature and the new focus on historical or literal sense of Scripture that we find promoted by both humanists and Protestant reformers contributed to a collapse of the symbolic world of the Middle Ages and paved the way for new mathematical and taxonomical readings of the natural world. Equally importantly, when read in a literal way, the biblical narratives of Adam's fall from grace and the biblical conception of the importance of exercising dominion over nature, these took on a new force when read literally. And this worldly I'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at our specific examples. The this worldly orientation of Protestantism, to use Weber's expression, its elevation of the status of earthly vocations, not merely the clerical vocation, its word-oriented literalist mindset, and the new incentives provided by biblical imperatives to establish dominion over nature were all of profound importance for these new ways of interpreting nature that we associate with the emergence of modern science, and particularly so in 17th century England. As I've alluded to already, one biblical theme in particular was vitally important, and that is expounded more in this book on the fall of man and the foundations of science. And what this work does, it explores a recurring motif that we first find in Francis Bacon writing in the first decades of the 17th century. And it's a Baconian ideology that the Royal Society quite explicitly take up in the latter half of the 17th century. But to see how this works for Bacon, this is what Bacon says about why we ought to be doing science. He says, man by the fall fell both from his innocency and from his dominion over the creation. Both of these losses can be in some measure repaired, the former by religion and faith, and the latter by the arts and sciences. So the purpose of scientific activity is to help us re-establish a dominion over the natural world that we lost as a consequence of Adam's fall. And this theme that we find in Bacon becomes a recurring motif in justifications of the Royal Society's activities in natural philosophy, as we'll see when we look at least some of the individuals. So not only did this idea of a partial restoration of lost dominion over nature join together the goals of the Christian religion with those of the new natural philosophy, but the notion of a fallen intellect and limited human senses also underpin justifications for an experimental approach to the natural world. Given the infirmities of human nature and our proneness to error, the fallen state of the natural world itself, the regimen of an experimental approach was proposed as the best way forward. And a compact summary of this is given here in the first two books published under the auspices of the Royal Society, the famous Micrographia by Robert Hooke. And what Hooke says in the preface to this work, setting up why we're engaged in this scientific enterprise: every man, both from a derived corruption, original sin, innate and born within him, and from his breeding and converse with men, is very subject to slip into sorts of errors. Okay, so we're prone to error. Here's the epistemological project. And these being the dangers in the process of humane reason, the remedies of them all can only proceed from the real, the mechanical, and the experimental philosophy. But that just sums up the project in a nutshell, that our fallen condition, to some extent, in terms of the knowledge that Adam was imagined to have had encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world because he named the beast, we can to some extent recapture that encyclopedic knowledge through science. So there is, as it were, a divine injunction to reconquer the natural world. So returning very briefly to Merton before I go on, it's significant that the systematic suspicion of the knowledge-making capabilities of human beings, engendered, as I've argued, by belief in the fallen condition of the human mind, yields an experimentalism that shares two of the key elements that Merton associated with Puritan-inspired science: communalism and organised scepticism. Right? Because of the frailty of our cognitive apparatus, we need communal activities and we need a specific experimental regimen. And this is a radically different conception of natural philosophy, which prior to this had been thought to be the activities of solitary great minds. Okay. So the spread and broad appeal, I think, of these religious conceptions makes head-counting exercises in some respects irrelevant and confounds attempts to align the religious ideology of the early Royal Society with Puritanism, latitudinarianism, or Anglicanism. But I think the failure of the narrow statistical correlations in this respect doesn't necessarily threaten a more general thesis about the recurrence of particular Protestant values and ideas in justifications of the activities of the Royal Society and of its experimental approach. To put it another way, certain key religious themes recur with remarkable consistency in discourse about science and its justifications in 17th century England, and they do not necessarily correlate with any narrowly defined religious identity. The motifs that I've encountered time and time again are, first of all, the one that we've just alluded to, the idea of re-establishing dominion over nature, the importance of the recovery of a lost Adamic knowledge, the idea of scientific activity as a religious vocation, and the accompanying conviction that the pursuit of science is an inherently religious activity, the belief that experimental philosophy is a regimen that overcomes our moral and intellectual deficiencies, and advocacy of the pursuit of useful knowledge, conceptualised as Christian charity, and not least the idea that the growth of science and technology in England during this period was part of a general providential plan. Most of these themes are present in the work of Francis Bacon, but they're consistently rehearsed throughout the century, and they appear in defences of the Royal Society, which, as I've said, if it had an ideology, it was one that was avowedly Baconian. Typically, though, they're also overlaid with the more general theme of natural theology, according to which natural history and natural philosophy establish the wisdom and power of God in the created order. Now, what I want to do in the final section of this lecture is just to look at two specific examples. There are a number of examples that I could have chosen that will make the point. I want to say these individuals I'm not claiming here that these individuals are typical of the whole fellowship of the Royal Society. I don't think they are, but I've chosen them because we'll see how these particular themes I've identified are articulated by them in the context of explaining what they're up to and why they're doing what they are doing. And the two people I'll look at, I've stacked the deck in my favour, I must confess, Thomas Spratt and Robert Boyle. I mean, I could have the other possibilities of people like John Ray, Isaac Newton, John Wilkins, but we'll get the general idea, I think, if we look at these two. So here's Thomas Spratt, late Bishop of Rochester. Spratt became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1663, following John Wilkins' nomination. He was almost immediately commissioned, this is in 1663, to write a history of the society. A society that at this stage was at most 3 years old. He got his royal charter in 1662. Now, why is he commissioned to write this history? It's going to be rather brief. The work was intended to silence the scoffing of the society's detractors, to answer the doubts of those sceptical about its methods, and to reassure those who feared that the activities of the Royal Society constituted a threat to religion and society. So there's been considerable discussion about the extent to which Spratt's history is representative of the views of the Royal Society, and if it were, what's the precise nature of the views that he espouses. I think on the first point it's clear that Spratt's work was both encouraged by Wilkins and was informed by the Council. On publication, it raised some concerns among members because, like other organisations, the Royal Society, then as now, were not all of one mind about these kinds of things. But there was clearly an effort to stand behind this statement once this history of the Royal Society, once it had appeared. And what we see is that it doesn't represent a Puritan perspective, but it certainly puts forward ideas that are consonant with the Puritan justifications of science. Now, while, as we've seen, Spratt claims that the Fellows of the Royal Society do not meddle with divinity, he makes an unambiguous claim to religion to establish the legitimacy of the Royal Society and of its experimental approach. And he goes on, he says, the weightiest and most solemn part of his history of the Royal Society was to make a defence of the society and the new experimental learning in respect of the Christian faith. Okay, so that's the aim. This he largely accomplished, he attempted to accomplish this through an appeal to the religious utility of the society's work. So he points out that the experimental philosophers of the society are, quote, prepared to admit a deity and to embrace the consequences of that concession. He goes on to say that the experimental philosopher, from his experiments, is furnished with arguments to adore the deity. He has always before his eyes the beauty, contrivance and order of God's works, and from thence he will learn to serve him with all reverence, who, in all that he has made, consult an ornament as well as use. Spratt here makes reference both to general natural theological considerations and the idea that God created useful things, the purpose of which can be discovered by diligent investigators. The new philosophy, he claimed, I quote, shall impart to us the uses of all the creatures. So here's a strong utilitarian element that Bacon refers to, Burton draws our attention to, and so on. Beyond this, Spratt also advances the claim that experimental philosophy is really a privileged kind of theological exercise. Because of the experimental natural philosopher's expert knowledge of the ways of the Creator, his praises will be more suitable to the divine nature, quote, than the blind applauses of the ignorant. Spratt then makes the bold claim that this praising God from the study of nature was actually the original form of religion that Adam had practiced before he fell. Quote, this natural philosophy, this was the first service that Adam performed to his Creator when he obeyed him in mustering and naming and looking into the nature of all the creatures. This had been his only religion if men had continued innocent in paradise and had not wanted a redemption. The activities of the Royal Society were thus regarded as a rehearsal of the prelapsarian religion of Adam. And in a sense, this reflects the twofold distinction that we see in Bacon. We have religion as we now understand as a consequence of our moral fall, but the original religion was really scientific activity. Spratt also considers the emergence of the new learning and the founding of the Royal Society in particular as part of a providential plan for a general reformation. He asks his readers, and I quote, to behold the agreement that's between the present design of the Royal Society and that of our Church at its beginning. These institutions, he argued, may lay equal claim to the word reformation, the one having encompassed it in religion, the other having purposed it in philosophy. Indeed, it's recently been argued, I'm trying to find my reference, but I can't. I think it was an article that came out last year. It's recently been argued that Spratt regarded England as the new Israel, especially favoured by Providence, and that the Royal Society was destined to play a key role in the scientific and economic fortunes of the nation. In sum then, Spratt's history gives voice to most of the themes that I've identified as common currency in discussions about the relation of religion and natural philosophy during this period in England. Now, as I said, I've stacked the deck in my favour, so our second example is Robert Boyle. I think Boyle's scientific achievements are well known and need no repetition. He was a key figure in the pre-Royal Society group that met in Oxford in the later 1650s. He was present at the first meeting of the Royal Society and came to be regarded by some, at least, as the very personification of the activities of the Royal Society. Boyle's conviction that the new natural philosophy would offer support for religion is a persistent theme throughout his work. He continually stressed the fact that natural philosophy and natural history provide us with rational grounds, quote, to believe, admire, adore and obey the deity. It was Boyle's conviction that, as he put it, quote, the new philosophy may furnish us with some new weapons for the defence of our most ancient creed. And it was this that inspired him to endow the Boyle Lectures. These famous lectures reinstated in 2004 actually at St Mary le Bow, and John Brooke will be giving the next one on February 18 roughly, quite soon, the week after next anyway. If you're there in London and you'd like to go, I'm sure it'll be worth it because he's going to talk about Robert Boyle. At any rate, these lectures were designed to prove the truth of the Christian religion against infidels without descending to any controversies amongst Christians. So there's the meddle with divinity bit. But the whole aim of these lectures is to prove the Christian religion against the infidels. So like Spratt, Boyle also suggested that natural philosophers need to go beyond simply offering arguments in support of the truths of natural theology. He says they have special expertise in discerning the veracity of miracle claims and prophecy. Boyle is also conscious of our epistemic limitations, and this is the fourth theme, and how these must inform the conduct of natural philosophy. He speaks of the inbred pride of man, exemplified in Adam's presumption in Eden. As a consequence of our pride, quote, our understandings are so universally biased and imposed on by our wills and affections. Once aware of this, however, we can stand guard against our inherent biases, and the experimental philosophy as a public method of witnessing provides one such way in which we can apply this regimen to correct our inherent inclination towards error. And then Boyle goes on to say, quote, we shall hereafter discover other utilities, and perhaps nobler ones than have been thus discovered hitherto, so that here again the utilitarian element. As Francis Bacon suggested earlier, the discovery of the uses of natural things that can promote human welfare and result in acts of charity, as Boyle goes on to say, quote, and therefore I reckon the investigation and divulging of useful truths in physics and medicine, and the discovery and recommending of good remedies amongst the greatest and most extensive acts of charity, so that the products of science are regarded as the promotion of Christian charity. Now, if the discovery of the uses of things leads to charitable acts, it also satisfies another divine imperative, that of exercising dominion over nature. So Boyle says that the pursuit of science, natural philosophy, quote, is not only delightful, as it teaches us to know nature, but it also teaches us, in many cases, to master and command her. Okay, so again, the notion of exercising dominion over nature. And then finally, Boyle also develops the idea that on account of these religious themes, the performance of natural... so there's the mastering and command. In addition to this, Boyle goes on to say that the study of nature, and here he's echoing again Spratt, is the first act of religion equally obliging in all religions. It's a philosophical worship of God. Goes on to say, discovering to others the perfections of God displayed in the creatures is a more acceptable act of religion than the burning of sacrifice or perfumes upon his altars. And Boyle makes reference to the biblical allusion to reasonable worship and says, actually, this is what the activity of natural philosophy consists in. Now, I don't want to keep you here indefinitely, but I think as we can see, that Spratt and Boyle each give voice to a number of the central themes that I've identified as being part of this core religious ideology that motivates or sanctions the pursuit of science. And as I said, my aim in considering these two is not to suggest that every single fellow of the Royal Society had these views, but that there are certain broad claims that tend to recur, particularly in apologetic defences of the Society and its activities. These claims are not the exclusive property of any single religious constituency, but form part of a broad currency of religious ideas that underpinned and motivated scientific inquiry in the 17th century. All right, so to my conclusion then. A number of historians have maintained and continue to maintain that religion played a significant role in the emergence and equally persistence of experimental science in the 17th century. These claims at one level are hardly surprising in view of the fact that the 17th and 18th centuries were, in one sense, the most religious in the history of the Christian West. And I won't elaborate on that claim, but I'll come back to it if you like questions. Given this, it would have been astounding had religion not played a key role in such scientific institutions as the Royal Society. What there has been less agreement on is precisely how religion might have exerted its influence. This has been manifested in disagreements about whether a specifically Puritan ethos motivated early modern science and became the ruling ideology of the Royal Society. What I've tried to argue in this lecture is that an exclusive focus on these narrowly defined religious affiliations, such as Puritan, is not particularly helpful. I've identified as an alternative focus for attention a complex of religious ideas, which, although they transcend tightly defined denominational affiliations, nonetheless inspired and legitimated scientific activity during this period. I hope also to have shown that it's important when considering the influence of religion on science that we ask the right kinds of questions, and there are a number of different questions that we can ask about. Whereas we often tend to think of religious influence manifesting itself unhelpfully in the content of scientific ideas, far more important for this period is the manner in which religion lent social legitimacy to scientific activities and institutions, provided motivations for key individuals in those institutions, and not least informed their goals and methods. When we pose these kinds of questions, the importance of religion in the establishment of the Royal Society and in the public justification of its activities seems undeniable. And before I draw this to a close, it's worth saying something very briefly about the present situation and the not uncommon view that science and religion are, by their very nature, in conflict. In the wake of the Michael Rice affair in September 2008, Nobel laureate Sir Harry Kroto was to articulate this view when he spoke of, quote, the fundamentally irresolvable conflict in the science and religion interface. Michael Rice, you will recall, was the Anglican clergyman who had been the Royal Society's Director of Science Education and who was basically misreported as having advocated the teaching of creation science in schools. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this led to calls for his dismissal. One of the arguments advanced by those who demanded that he be removed from his position was that by virtue of his clerical vocation and his religious commitments, he was necessarily unfit for such a post within the Royal Society. Kroto put it this way, quote, he, together with all religious people, whether they like it or not, whether they accept it or not, fall at the first hurdle of the main requirement for honest scientific discussion, because they accept unfounded dogma as having fundamental significance. In other words, religious commitment, and certainly the clerical vocation, he argues, is necessarily inconsistent with what he refers to as the scientific mindset and intellectual integrity. Clearly, the 17th century founders of the Royal Society would have been perplexed to learn this. Not only the significant numbers of clergymen who filled important posts in the early Royal Society, but also such key individuals as Boyle, who thought of himself as belonging to a new kind of scientific priesthood. If we begin our historical investigations with flawed and overstated assumptions about some essential opposition between science and religion, we're bound to create a fictional past and misunderstand the motivations and beliefs of the relevant historical actors. It would be an interesting project to consider the things that have changed since the formation of the Royal Society in the 17th century, such that these kinds of claims about an essential incompatibility between science and religion seem plausible, but that's the subject of another lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We have time for a few questions. If anybody, you're willing to answer them, I'm sure you are. If anybody has any, just put your hand up. We have some microphones. Yeah.
Hello. One word that you didn't mention, or I didn't hear it, was the word curiosity. And in my experience, almost every scientist I've met is a curious person. They like to know how things work. And I think that was also true with the early members of the Royal Society. You can see that in Sprat's history with the account of the experiments they all did. They were obviously having great fun. And the other thing that occurred was that one shouldn't think of it just as a investigation of nature. I think one has also to think of it in its applied terms, and that applies right back to the beginning as well. And in that history, which I was looking at this afternoon, Lord Branker tells you how guns recoil, and Hook, I think, cuts up a dog just to see what's inside it. And there were 3 or 4 others that were clearly done both for how things work. Oh, there was another one, how to make gunpowder. And so there's that balance here, even in those days, from the curiosity of these people. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think that both of these are very good points, that you have not merely the theoretical and the practical. The curiosity is a very interesting one, because traditionally, of course, curiosity had been listed amongst the vices. Curiosity was not well regarded, and from the Church Fathers on, in the lists of particular vices, we find curiosity. It's actually, pride we know is the worst of the vices, and curiosity is the first of the subset of these. So there's some quite interesting work that has to go on over the course of the 17th century to try and rehabilitate this conception of curiosity. And Bacon addresses this quite specifically, but it's relevant because when we consider the criticisms of the Royal Society at the time, one of them is that they're simply engaged in curious practices. They're exercising curiosity, and part of the argument here was to no specific end. Now, that then brings us to the practical things. We tend to think of the practical activities of the Royal Society. I mean, perhaps gunpowder is not the best choice of things in terms of wonderful practical boons to society, but we tend to think of these practical things as being part of a justification. But in the context of the 17th century, these were not appropriate things for learned people to be engaged in. And so part of the critique of the activities of the Royal Society is that they'd taken a dignified activity of philosophy, which is a contemplative kind of activity, and that they had sullied it by linking it up with these rather crass mechanical and artisanal kinds of practices. So, as I say, both curiosity and the practical elements of the activities of the society were held against them, and they needed to do considerable work to, as I say, give these sorts of things some kind of moral tractability. And that's why I think we get this conception of Christian charity now rejigged, specifically by Bacon, but also by people in the Royal Society, as a kind of practical welfare, as opposed to some kind of personal virtue. So the points you raise are very interesting, but as I say, there's a very complicated background to both of them. And again, it goes back to the question of what are the values that you appeal to make both curiosity and this, what appears to be crass utilitarianism, as it were, sanctify them. And it's interesting that religion in both cases is used precisely for those purposes.
How much of the work was done actually for the Royal Navy? I read somewhere that the interests of royalty were that the Royal Navy should be supplied with better equipment. And the other question in my mind was, is it true that there was a lot of Masonic involvement, Freemasonry, in the early Royal Society?
I think on the second question, not that I'm aware of, the American historian Margaret Jacob has done some interesting work in Freemasonry, but to my knowledge, there's not a strong connection, and I would not expect to find one. In terms of the practical activities of the Royal Society, certainly not in the earliest years. I don't think we have this cosy relationship with government as we would now put it. But again, part of the justifications that we see in the latter half of the 17th century are precisely to do with England's status in Europe, and these notions are going to be relevant. So there were two, as I said, I mentioned there were two books that were published under the auspices of the Royal Society, and micrography was one of them. The other one was a book by John Evelyn about trees. And trees, of course, are relevant to the Navy in terms of having forests to prepare the timber. So there certainly are connections there, but I would say that neither of those are kind of strong impulses in the earliest years of the society.
I was wondering if you mentioned that there was a lot of kind of utilitarian undertones to the formation of like early experimental learning in the formation of the Royal Society. And I wondered if you had any comments on kind of there seemed to be like a shift from deontology to teleological ethics that ran parallel with the kind of the way that science was kind of propelled forward into society.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I'm not aware of anyone who's actually done all of the work that needs to be done. But you're quite right to say that, and ethics has its own problems, partly because, I mean, for a number of reasons. But there's so many things I could say about this, so let me just try a few that hopefully are to the point. I mean, one of the critiques that you get against the Royal Society is that in dismissing Aristotelian philosophy, they're actually dismissing what was the most important part of Aristotle, which was his ethics. And so you have a conception of the conservative worry of critics of the Royal Society that the whole scientific project is going to skew education away from what's most important, which is moral formation. And so that's part of the general picture. And you see this explicitly expressed by Henry Stubb when he criticises the Royal Society. He says, okay, you've done away with Aristotle's natural history, natural philosophy, but the key part of Aristotle is the ethics. And Stubb's concern is that that's what's going to go. And it's interesting that, of course, at this time we do have a decline in virtue ethics, such that when Alistair MacIntyre rediscovers virtue ethics in the last century, this is news to everyone that, oh, we've actually got this whole other moral tradition apart from deontology and utilitarianism. There is this whole lost tradition. But I think part of it also was that Protestant critique of the standard moral practices was another. So natural law theory was very hard to get up and running in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, partly because Protestants were very sceptical about our capability as fallen human beings to discern through reason what were appropriate moral imperatives. As for the connection between Baconian utilitarianism and what later then under Bentham becomes, a specific meta-ethical position, I think there's a fairly, because the appearance of utilitarian, well, actually that's not true, because we've got theological utilitarians in people like, what's the natural theology guy? Paley's, thank you, how could I forget? Paley's ethical position kind of theological utilitarianism. So, yeah, I'll need to think about that, but it's a very interesting point, and I hope to actually work on this very question if I live long enough.
I think probably that's a good point. Thank you very much. That we should pause because I know some people have to get away to dinner and so on. But there is a bookstall. There are some free refreshments at the back. Do please come, and I'm sure you'll be very happy to talk to people informally. Next lecture will be by Professor Bill Newsom from Stanford University. He's talking about God, Brain and Mind on 27th of April. Not here. It's actually in Downing College Howard Theatre. So watch out for that. But it remains to thank Professor Harrison very much again. Thank you very much.